Welcome back for part 2 of working with Scouts with Autism Spectrum Disorders. If you haven't watched part 1, I encourage you to go back and look at that, because the subject of that is what are autism spectrum disorders. Now we're in part 2. We're going to talk about what makes autism spectrum kids different from other kids. So let's go on to our presentation now. The first thing that makes ASD boys different is how they handle transitions. And transitions are instances where you need to move from one activity to another or one subject to another in the process of a meeting or a scout outing. One thing you'll find with autism spectrum kids is that they typically will have some kind of a special interest, and that is something that they almost are obsessive about, a subject that they know everything in the world about, and they assume that you care about it as much as they do. If you go try and have a conversation with them, they're going to try and pull you to their special topic rather than work with the topic you're trying to discuss with them. The topic of these special interests could be almost anything. They can be things that seem pretty ordinary for a kid, like dinosaurs and baseball players, onto something really weird like dead-end streets, the names of dead-end streets, and prime numbers. If the preoccupation is more strange, it'll make it harder for them to fit in with the kids around them. If the preoccupation is a thing that sounds like a good kid topic, it'll make it harder for them to adapt as adults. So there's not really a great situation with the special interests. It just is what it is. Second aspect is that autistic kids are tend to be very regimented in their thinking. If they've been told things are going to go in steps 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, they expect steps 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. If you as the adult leader recognize after step 3 that you're running out of time and you're going to have to stop the activity and move on to something else, you will have a difficult time getting your ASD scout to move along with you to the new activity. He really wants to finish all the other steps. That makes them hard to shift to a new activity when you want them to, for an autistic kid. Another quirk that they often have is some form of a repetitive ritual. Some of these kids, and the way I describe it, an example would be like a boy who comes home from school or comes in the house, and every time he comes in the house he goes to the refrigerator and opens and closes the door without looking in it or without getting anything out of it before he'll go on to something else. For a scout on an outing, it might be a boy who insists on walking around his tent 3 times with a flashlight before he will enter the tent to go to bed for the night. Usually the repetitive rituals are harmless, but they do make the ASD scout stand out from his peers and makes it a little harder for him to be accepted by his peer group. As you can imagine, ASD boys often get misdiagnosed at first as either attention deficit disorder or obsessive compulsive because of these obvious features of their disability, even though what's going on is really autism. Intellectual attributes of autistic kids. First of all, autistic kids, if you test them for IQ, you're going to find they fall all along the intelligence spectrum just like any other group of boys would fall. And by definition, that means that most of them are going to have normal or higher than normal IQ. However, that intelligence is a little bit different than a neurotypical boy, and I describe it as the difference between the beauty of a rose versus the beauty of a crystal. They're both beautiful in their own way, but the crystalline kind of intelligence that an autistic kid has it's more rigid and more rote learning oriented. As you can imagine, when I talked about the way a brain's wired for an autistic kid with those super high rays, is they have exceptional long-term memory. Their filing capability for information is better than most kids, and their ability to retrieve that information is better than most kids. Where they are challenged is in trying to integrate information, take 3 or 4 different pieces and put it together to make something new. That doesn't work as well for an autistic kid. As you might expect, they tend to use language in a precocious, and by that means in an adult way. If they're talking about especially if they're talking about their special interest, they will sound like a little professor. And in fact, that was one of the nicknames for Aspergers when it was first coming out in psychological circles. It was called the little professor syndrome. The other thing about their language, though, is they have a very literal understanding of language. And by that I mean they don't understand idioms well unless they're taught idioms directly. An idiom is an expression in English that does not mean what the words exactly say. For example, cat got your tongue, or it's raining cats and dogs, or not even in the ballpark. Those are expressions that have a meaning, but they become disconnected from the context, and they're very hard for an autistic person to process, unless they, like my son, actually sat down with a book of idioms and memorized all the idioms in the book. Physical skills of autistic kids, they do show some differences in motor skills from the rest of the population. They're a little more clumsy in general. and that can have effects on fine coordination skills like writing, cutting, pasting, knot tying. It can have an effect on gross coordination, things like running, skipping, jumping, and swimming, particularly in the Scout program. Swimming is an issue. And then the third attribute with motor skills it's reported that these boys have poor endurance. Now, from my personal experiences, I sometimes question whether they really have poor endurance or they simply just don't see the point in running long distances or hiking long distances, and therefore balk because of their because it doesn't make sense to them, not because they can't physically do it. These boys can also be very vulnerable to sensory overload. Again, coming back to that superhighways in the brain thing. These kids often have a much more direct connection between their sensory organs, their ears, their eyes, whatever, back into their brain. That makes it easy for them to get overloaded if it's a visual issue with clutter in their visual field, bright lights sometimes. If it's auditory, loud noises or just jumbled noises can be hard on them. It can also be their sense of smell. They can be just totally shut down by certain smells, certain tastes, textures of food, the sensations on their skin. One kind of cotton fabric versus synthetic fabric can be issues for them. Now, each boy, they learn pretty quickly what their issues are. The parents will know. They can help guide you to avoid these sensory overload issues. And I'll talk more about how we handle it in Scout meetings later in another section. The good part about their physical differences is that they often have a different and more perceptive awareness of their surroundings. These kids may very well get a lot more out of the nature hike than your neurotypical boys. Social issues are a big thing with autistic kids. These kids do not pick up on nonverbal communication or social cues. They often have a difficult time reading facial expressions. They just don't read facial expressions in most instances. They can't tell from looking at you that you're angry with them or that you're happy with them. They also have issues with the social aspects of language, tone of voice, and you'll find that an autistic kid is often very blunt in how they use language. They will seem rude to others. But they will also miss out on tone of voice. For instance, if I were to say sit down versus sit down, the difference in tone of voice will be lost on an autistic kid, whereas a neurotypical kid would know from one that I'm not unhappy and the other that I'm about ready to lynch them. They will also have, these boys, because of that precocious speech, they're going to have peculiar speech patterns. They're going to make them kind of stick out from the crowd in the way they use language. They're not going to sound like a regular kid, and they're going to have a harder time fitting in with the regular kids because of it. And the last social aspect has to do with physical space, things like touching. It's not unusual for an autistic kid to touch people that aren't appropriate. In other words, they make no distinctions between friends and family and strangers with terms to who they will touch or how they will interact with personal space. And then that word injustice, what I want to point out there is that an autistic kid may be offended by something that occurs to them that is really innocuous. My example with my son was going to day camp. My son finds a bottle cap, and he thinks it's a neat toy. Well, the scout next to him says, "Here, let me take that for you." And he takes the bottle cap and goes and tosses it in the trash because we've taught him leave no trace. Well, my son saw that as an injustice and physically acted out and hit the other kid. But that's an example of where you have these social disconnects that can cause misbehavior with an ASD scout. Now, before we jump to the next section, let's talk about how scouting appeals to boys. I've told you what these scouts are like. First thing that advantage we have is that scouting does not require the situational awareness of team sports. And by that what I mean is that, for instance, let's take soccer for instance. You can't play soccer well without paying attention to where every other player is on the field, even the ones that are very far away from you. You have to pay attention to where the ball is on the field at any time, even if it's not close to you. You have to pay attention to what direction it's going and how the play is developing. Those are things that an autistic kid really has a hard time with, is integrating that kind of information that isn't, frankly, right in their face. Second thing is we don't require good motor skills to be a good scout. That's not to say we don't have scouts that have wonderful motor skills, but you don't have to be. You can take your time, you can accomplish almost anything in scouting without having to be gifted in a physical sense. We also encourage a diverse exploration of the world. Now, we're working against that. Their internal nature wants to pull them toward deeper and deeper into their special interest. our program tends to push them out into a broader exploration of the world around them. We get them into lots of different subject areas, lots of different environments, and that helps broaden their skill base as they go on in life. Similarly, on the social front, we provide a variety of social environments, everything from dealing with their tent mate up to dealing with a patrol or den size group, 8, 10, 12 boys, up to dealing with a pack or a troop where you might have 30, 40, 50 boys. They will be dealing with adults, they will be dealing with other youth, they'll be dealing with youth that are older than them, youth that are younger than them. We provide this rich social environment for them to learn social skills from. Then the last area where we help autistic kids is we have self-paced advancement. We don't force them rigidly into a particular path where they have to move at a certain skill pace to keep up with their team. They can adapt their pace, and for instance, if they're being overwhelmed by sensory overload at one gathering, we can take a time out. They can come back and try again. One of my favorite things about scouting is that you have unlimited do-overs. Now we're at the end of part 2 of the presentation. By now you've got a pretty good feel for what autism spectrum disorders are, their origins, and what the kids are like. And you recognize that the kids can be different from each other, and you have to be flexible and adaptable, and partly because they aren't. So please come back for part 3, which will be how to work with the family of an ASD youth, how to get off to a good start in that relationship.